Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying Shop Talk as much as I am, because foundations have been the focus of my work for so many years. As you can see, there's a lot that goes into picking those foundations, but there's even more that goes into combining them. So that's what we're going to see in this chapter. But before we get into it, I want to talk about accessibility. Accessibility shouldn't feel optional. So regardless of a company's priority, we as designers have the responsibility to make sure that people with disabilities can use our products safely and confidently. And it's not just about disabilities. Think about design as an inclusive process. So we're designing products for our parents, for the elderly, for people from other cultures. There's a lot to learn about designing for accessibility. I always get so excited when I talk to accessibility experts because I learn things that shift the way I do my work. Luckily, there is a lot of content that you can access for free. We've made a selection for you in the course material. But in the meantime, here's a few things that I think will spark your interest and help you make better decisions on your day-to-day. Learn about contrast requirements. To create guidelines on color usage, you will need to know about it, or else you will be making decisions that might break the experience. Think about navigation beyond the sighted experience. For example, screen readers. Did you know that text formatting dictates how screen readers guide users? Using proper HTML semantic structure is critical to translating a visual interface to an audio one.
About UCSF. Link. Search UCSF. Rating percent. 75%, 70%, 65%, 60%, 55%, 50%, 45%, 40%. Link. UCSF Medical Center.
Make sure not to use color alone to convey a meaning. Something as simple as combining color or text with an icon can make a huge difference for users with low vision and people with cognitive disabilities. So now that we know a little bit more about accessibility and foundations, let's talk about how to combine them. So let's quickly recap on the colors that we've chosen. So we've created a grayscale for foundations. We've chosen a blue, green, yellow, and red for status and feedback, and purple for accent or primary color. Now let's define how these colors get applied to the UI. To make these decisions, you have to know about web contrast guidelines. When we talked about accessibility, we mentioned that color should never be used independently. Text is one of the elements that color can support but not replace. Text elements should hit a contrast ratio of 4.5 out of 1, according to WCAG contrast guidelines. You can find online tools and plugins to measure this easily. In the course material, you will find my favorite. Color perception changes significantly with the lightness of the color. That is to say that the darker a color gets, the hardest it is to identify which color it is. And it gets even trickier when it comes to people with color blindness. On top of that, there are multiple types of color blindness. So the best practice is to use color with text only when strictly necessary. If you're using a primary color or blue for links, the most accessible thing to do is accompany it with an underline or an icon. If you're using other colors to emphasize the meaning of a piece of text, try adding a leading icon next to it. Always question whether it's necessary or not to use color in that system. Think of color as a budget. Don't splurge too much or the experience will end up broken. For icons and other graphic elements, the contrast requirement is lower. It goes all the way down to 3 out of 1. So we have a bit more flexibility to use colors with icons without text, as long as the icon represents clearly what it means. For this reason, it's still better to pair it with text. These and other visual tricks can cause inconsistency, but not as much if we use design tokens. So we're gonna talk about what they are and why they are awesome. So what are design tokens? It was hard for me to create my own definition, so the best one I could find is by the actual creator of design tokens, Gina. On her YouTube video, What the Fuck Are Design Tokens?, Gina shared a great description. According to her definition, design tokens are variables. They are language-agnostic variables that hold design decisions at the foundation level. They are agnostic to the extent that they can also be used for Figma or Sketch libraries. This makes the handover process from design to development pretty smooth. The most remarkable thing about design tokens is that they can be used for any type of foundation. They're used for color usage, typographic scale, spacing scale, responsive breakpoints, box shadow, etc. Design tokens are the concept that help the design industry bridge the gap between design and developer collaboration. And they get us a step closer to UI consistency. So thank you, Gina and the Salesforce team for open sourcing this framework. In the course material, you can find the full video and other content about the subject. Before embarking on your design tokens journey, you should know that naming the variables is the most difficult part. Naming is hard. That's our industry's favorite understatement. But there's always things you can do to smooth out the process. Names should be simple and self-explanatory. This means that we need to find words that everybody understands. This sounds impossible, but luckily we can create guidelines for it. So let me share some tips I learned throughout my experience with naming tokens. Include properties or UI elements where their styles are going to be applied. This is what I mean by self-explanatory. For example, using the word border or text doesn't leave much room for ambiguity. Define a syntax. Same as with any language, syntax helps us communicate with common patterns. This is especially important because token libraries are expected to grow. It would be a shame to solve inconsistency on the product, but have token libraries be inconsistent within themselves. Define semantic fields systematically. Words for hierarchy, like emphasis, bold, subtle, subdued. Define meanings, like success or positive or error. Presentational words, blue, bold, square, shadow, background, transparent. Sizes, large or L, small or default. Define loaded words. You can also recommend words that shouldn't be used to avoid ambiguity. For example, if you go with primary, advise against using main or call to action or predominant for an accent color. Speaking of predominant, choose short words whenever possible. Avoid abbreviations unless they're as obvious as BG for background or XS for extra small. So now that we're a little bit more equipped, let's create some tokens. These are the colors I picked in the previous chapter. First, I will choose the darkest to be applied to text. This will be 90% of the content. So for this darkest one, I'll name it text default. Next, I will use the same color to create a softer variation for the text that is secondary, like subtitles or captions. I will use the word subdued for this one, and it will be 70% opacity of the default one. I will pick my accent color for links or interactive states and name it Text Interactive. I use these names instead of things like text black or text purple, so that in the future, if we change something like accent color, we will only change the hex value that it's using. This is particularly handy if you plan on having multiple themes in your product, because default text is always the default. But still, it isn't always dark or black across different themes. For example, the default text would be off-white or light gray in dark mode. Another group of design tokens is backgrounds and borders. These are typically designed to be combined together. For example, I will choose a lighter shade for the background. In this case, I will choose green. I like this color to be used to highlight positive messages. Because it's a background, it should hit the contrast ratio with our text variables. So I want to pair it with default text in this case. And for naming, I think this should be named background success, and it's pretty standard across different design systems. I will choose the middle shade for the border with a lowered opacity of 60%, and we'll call that border success. I'll follow these same steps for the rest of the feedback colors and my accent color. And with our library ready, we can start applying our design tokens to core components. So let's start by looking at the anatomy of these simple parts. Remember, from atoms to molecules, from foundations to components. Let's take a look. Buttons. It's how users trigger actions. And there are typically different levels of hierarchy that buttons can have inside an interface. Any system has at least two types of buttons, a primary one and a neutral or a secondary one. To create these buttons, these are the elements you will need. A background, where the content lies. A border, you can use for both buttons or just for the secondary. A text, to label the button. An icon, as visual support to the button and the nature of the action. Spacing, how text and icons are laid out inside the button. And there are some others. Using what you know about your company and system, what else could you use to spice things up and really support the product's identity? Text input. This is how the user talks to the system. There are many accessibility requirements around designing forms, which you'll find in the course material. For this exercise, we will focus on a straightforward one. A background, where the content lies. A border, that is recommended to outline where the content needs to go, with enough contrast. And you will also need it for states. Text placeholder. It's visual support and shouldn't be the only way to understand what goes into the input. Text label. Leading text where the user should learn what goes in the input. Icon option. You may need to use the input for a search feature, which usually goes with a leading visual on the left side. Or you may need it to support a validation queue, for example, in error or success states. Text footnote. You may need a more minor text element to add additional information in some cases. For example, for error states explaining the problem and how to fix it. Or in cases where your different users' levels of understanding can vary. They may not want to see a description every time they fill out a form, but first-time users might appreciate the elaboration. And spacing is how these elements are laid out. And some other things, would same as with buttons, find creative ways to add some expression. Sheets or card layouts. Not all systems have cards as part of the component library, but it's an excellent component to practice with. It's basically a small website or a view with spacing rules. Understand cards as frames. So again, a background, which is a blank surface, usually, where most of the components can be placed. A border. Use the borders to visually group all the elements inside the card. Spacing. Remember the box model? How are pieces laid out inside and what is the margin around them? And other. Do you want to use shadows? Could they have headers? Etc. Content block. Content exists in most of the products that we use. However, many design systems don't regulate how content is displayed.
But as content gets richer and more complex, we might actually need to create some guidelines for it, or even make the different combinations into a component. Remember, a good design system is commanding. We can name this component content block. So what are the elements inside a content block? We can find common text elements like headings and paragraphs, links, or metadata. We can also define other elements like spacing, the vertical spacing between heading and paragraphs, icon or illustration, for example for empty states, and media, for example images, video, or sound.
So this is it for design system foundations. Doing exercises like this is a great way to practice design systems thinking. However, the best way to learn and mature a design system is through collaboration. Find value in pairing with your teammates and learning from one another. I will see you in the next lesson where you will learn how to do design systems work at a more mature level of a system.